Hi, I'm Eric, and I'm a social studies educator, historian, and host of this, the Everything is a Primary Source podcast. I'm also an avid collector of popular culture artifacts. I love what I find at thrift store outlets, garage sale leftovers, and what I spot just making my way around the built world. I enjoy sorting through boxes of free books and magazines, not to mention online collections like Internet Archive and, of course, the Library of Congress. But you don't need to spend your time digging through bins or following online rabbit holes to get a look into the past. The movies and TV we watch, the books we read, and the games we play are all documents of the past. So is fashion, food, music, toys, even the roads we travel on and the places we live and work in. Everything is a primary source. This podcast is the result of exhibiting these kinds of artifacts in public, getting passersby to select an item they connect with, and then chatting with me to see what it says about the time, place, and people who made it. The conversation you are about to hear, therefore, is your history, my history, our history through popular culture. I'm being joined today by John Kozik, who I met just a little while ago in Salem, Massachusetts at the Witchboard Museum. And if you ever have the chance to visit Salem, Massachusetts, I feel like this is one of the must-sees in the entire city devoted to witches and everything else spooky, and your museum is fantastic. Thanks for joining the Everything is a Primary Source podcast.
My pleasure. Thanks so much for having me. Appreciate it.
So when my wife and I visited um, your museum, we were just taken aback by just how many Ouija boards, and I feel like I'm mispronouncing it. Is it Ouija or is it
The brand itself, the one that was first mass produced, is pronounced Ouija,
Ouija?
but you're not wrong for saying Ouija because when you ask someone if they use the board, you would ask them if they Ouija. So you Ouija on a Ouija, you verb on the noun.
I feel better now because this whole time I've been saying it properly, and we were just mesmerized by not only how many there are in your collection, but just how many like pop culture references there are embedded in them. There's the ones that are more traditional that everybody has seen before, but then you get some that are themed after movies and musicians and other horror related things. How long have you been curating the museum, and uh, where do you tend to get most of your uh, boards?
So I've been obsessed with the Ouija since the late 90s, and that's when I inherited my grandmother's board. And hers is a very the iconic look most people think about with a Ouija. And really going online to find more about it, finding there's hundreds, if not thousands, of boards. I just became a very obsessed collector. And my obsession for these, I would put against any collector of any item. Um, Really, I do anything and everything to get them. I've been known to get in a car within 2 hours, drive 21 hours straight to Florida to buy them, be in Burbank, California within 48 hours. So because there's so many different boards, most people are not aware, but you know, Ouija is the brand we all know. And these other boards just didn't compete very well against it. Whether it's when the war is over, less people cared about them, or they infringed by stealing the name, or they just couldn't compete in general. And so majority of what I hunt down is extremely rare. In the museum, probably less than 50 of each of most of the boards there. And so I've done everything from estate sales, flea market, yard sales, but I always make a joke that if you've met me more than one time, you'll probably remember that I'm the Ouija guy. And I mean that literally. I've been at the gym on the treadmill and people pull on my sleeve and hey, you want to buy a Ouija board for me? Because 6 years ago I had bought one on Craigslist from them and they remembered what I looked like. And sure enough, they drove around with one in their car, figuring they would run into me again. So literally everywhere you can imagine.
Well, the tour that you gave us was incredible. We learned so much from everything you had to say. And have you learned the history of Ouija and all of the associated products and boards and competing pieces through your collecting? Is it something that as you gather things and do a bit of research on it, you've put together this really great narrative, this history of I mean, can we call it a game or is it
I mean,
something?
it is considered a game. It's patented as a game. So yes. So I usually say play the Ouija.
But is that how you've essentially built your knowledge? It wasn't just, one long night of pouring through books, but just kind of
No,
connecting
I
things
mean,
together.
no, through collecting, I ended up meeting some other collectors and we formed a group called the Talking Board Historical Society. So we're a registered nonprofit who research and preserve celebrate the history of these boards. The president of that group, Robert Murch, he's the world historian. He's the guy that has gone down every rabbit hole for years and years and years trying to uncover these stories. And so really what I do right now, I regurgitate a lot of the history. He's the guy that figured it out, but I've
Mhm.
learned it from him and I've learned out how he figured it out. So not just the fact of, a woman being rediscovered, written out of history for 100 years who had named the board or approved the work to the patent office. I can tell you how that history was rediscovered. So I think I'm a little bit more obsessive about the history than most people. Murch is really the guy that has mentored me towards that history, though.
And I suppose that's what history is all about, and particularly when it's something as so specialized as talking boards, is that it's the way that the organization operates, I'm sure, and having mentors and having uh, students and people with the passion for it that you're lining everything up. You're kind of, putting things together, and that is in essence what history is all about. That somebody else conceivably could also gather all of these different boards, but they might come to a different, even just slightly different conclusion from what you did. And it's like a recipe in a way. It's like it's the person, it's the object, it's the places, it's the interactions that, their collection, and I'm sure there's other collectors nowhere compared to yours, but there are collectors that might derive even just a slightly different history from it. And that's really the essence of this podcast and everything that Everything as a Primary Source does is to line everything up and put it together and say, what does this tell us about the past? What can we learn about the different time periods? So if we're looking at the origin place of Ouija, of talking boards, around what time period are we starting with?
Well, the spiritualist movement in America, we call the mid 1800s, basically during the Civil War. And because everyone is, affected by death, everyone is trying different ways to communicate with the dead. And the talking board kind of evolves through these conversations. And it's not just invented one day. It's really two separate spirit communication tools that are crossing paths during the war. And it's about 1870 when we kind of start to really hear newspaper articles, talking about them. And it's not until 1886 that we actually get the first picture of one drawn in a newspaper from Akron, Ohio. So, 1870s, 1886 is kind of in the ballpark of when they're evolving and coming about, or I'm sorry, officially have kind of met each other and come out.
Were people uh, worried about it? Did they get superstitious about it in the beginning? It seems like it's almost has its own lore that's been built around it. I think I shared with you when we met a few months ago that um, the first time I ever interacted with one, I just didn't really want to touch it, and I don't know why. I wasn't like I had any. There was a story that my parents told from when they were first dating that my dad and his sisters were messing with my mom and communicated through a talking board to tell her to go home. And she freaked out. But I never had like a sense of, like I'm doing, but I was just like, I don't want to mess with anything. I don't want to get spirits riled up and angry at me. Um, Early on when this thing was first introduced and getting more popularized, was there that same kind of superstition or fear that people had, or was it pretty much just like, well, here's another thing that we have as part of our entertainment?
No, I mean, I make a joke, but basically bad things do happen from the history, the beginning of the history of the boards, but most people did not view it as an evil or negative thing. It actually was embraced. It sold quite well when it first came out. And today we kind of look with today's eyes, but at the time, people were viewing death very differently than today. When someone in your family died, you put them on display in the parlor, which became the funeral parlor, took photographs of them. So because people were viewing death much differently, they really view the Ouija board differently. And it sold very well right from the very beginning. And I would say majority of people didn't view it as an evil or negative thing.
Where would most people, the audience for this, I'm imagining, I'm just kind of picturing post-Civil War, upper middle class people would probably be the main audience of these things. Would they just have it in their parlor? Would they have it just on hand in their homes, or would they put it away somewhere? And then if company was over, like, hey, let's, do this, or was it reserved for seances or more elaborate spectacle type things?
Yeah, no, I think because it kind of comes from that spiritualist movement where a lot of people were having seances. It was an object brought out, for entertainment for people when they came over. Some of the box art you see at the very beginning, it's really families sitting around and using it. And later on by the 1920s and stuff, it's very romanticized and a way for men and women to kind of date unchaperoned and uh, not really under the guise of using a board game together. But that's a
Hmm.
little bit later. The original, it's families and it's entertainment at night.
It's interesting because I feel like the mount as the years go on, and this is an omnipresent toy game that could be played. It seems that by the time you get to, maybe you can mark the time period, but 70s, 80s, almost same time as Dungeons and Dragons, where people were worried about kids getting involved or too deeply obsessed with this board game, this role-playing game, and that they would, follow a dark path or something with it. Was the way that Ouija was packaged by then, and received by then, uh, remarkably different from the century before.
Yeah, I think the big change that happens would probably be the movie The Exorcist. Um, Prior to that movie, during a war, women would use the boards alone to speak to a deceased husband or a father. And in the horror movie, since that's how they explained how little Reagan, Linda Blair, became possessed, that superstition is then born.
Hmm.
And, even though bad things had happened from the beginning, it had been in horror movies from the very beginning, it really, most people, it becomes very subliminal. The Ouija scene in The Exorcist is never really talked about. They never blame the Ouija board. And so it takes some time before people, realize why that they might be afraid of the Ouija now or don't use it alone. It just plants very subliminally at that time. And after that movie, the Vietnam War ends, which is the last major US war with a draft. So less people really using the board the way it was intended to be, which was, connecting to a loved one that you had lost, to now more of a dare game or a sleepover party game. And I
Hmm.
think once your intent changes towards the board, you're probably not, I always make a joke. If you go looking for trouble on the Ouija, you'll probably find it. And I think after that, a lot of people are using it in a way that's not so serious.
It's remarkable how there's these intersections, almost like in this case, a movie, The Exorcist, T-Bones, Ouija, where it's just like kind of broadsides it and um it's just another piece of pop culture colliding with another one and then changing its trajectory like that. Because that movie is very subliminal as it is. You know, there's those flashes that you get throughout the film, especially during the more intense scenes to mess with you and to make you uncomfortable. And it really did have an impact and continues to have an impact on society and the way we see things. And so it's interesting that you say that the board itself, this thing that had been around for about a century by that point, was then likewise changed because of it. We talked a lot about some of its peripheral things and connected things, but I think we need to go down to who made this thing. Who is the originator? Or were there a few people that contributed to the creation of the original talking board?
Well, I mean, so the talking boards are evolving, post Civil War, really. And it's not until 1890 when Charles Kennard, who's, from Chestertown, Maryland, he teams up with some other business owners down there and they form the Kennard Novelty Company. And they make the first board originally mass produced, just called a witchboard, kind of just a generic name for it. A few months later, at a seance, a woman named Helen Peters, who happens to be Elijah Bond's sister-in-law, Elijah is the one that patented the Ouija board, but Helen asked the board what it wanted to be called, and it spelled back Ouija. And then she asked her, what does it mean? It spelled back good luck. So that's when the name Ouija came about. And but there's originally 5 people involved with the company, all from Baltimore, Chestertown area, and that's where it really starts.
It's funny. I actually, Chestertown is where I lived in Maryland,
Nice.
on the Eastern Shore. And I was telling you before we hit record that there's actually not, this is the very first time I heard that one of the creators of this board is from Chestertown, because I don't think there's any mention of that. Well, it should be, because it seems like, and you were telling me, a few months ago that in the cemetery in Baltimore, is the final resting place of which gentleman was it that is buried there with the tombstone of the
Yeah,
Ouija board?
that's Elijah Bond, who patented the Ouija. He's
Mhm.
buried at Greenmount Cemetery in Baltimore, and his headstone looks just like the patent drawing for the Ouija. The Talking Board Historical Society actually put that in back in 2007. He was buried in an unmarked grave, and after a 10-year search, we located where he was buried and then raised the money to put that headstone in.
Were any Ouijas used to locate his grave? You'd think that'd be perfect, right?
You would think it would have been a lot faster. In 1996 is when we went looking for where he was buried. So we called Greenmount, and at the time they actually said no, he wasn't buried there, but his wife and son were. And so thinking it was pretty strange, but whatever. So for the next 10 years, literally every cemetery in Virginia, Maryland, West Virginia were called to find out where he's buried. Murch went to Green Mountain person, and he had to get special permission to go to the records room where he flipped through the index cards and he found the other cards. He found Elijah's card stuck to his son and wife's card. So he was, in fact, the first place we had looked 10 years earlier.
That so you find yourself as the last place you look, right? That's in the first place you look and the last place. It
Yeah.
must be kind of exciting, but also frustrating at the same time. We were here. Uh, is there a significance, and I feel like there is, to Baltimore and Maryland in general being the origin place of this particular game, or at least the patent of it, the patent version? Were people making their own, or were there like just kind of more folk art versions before they patented the original board?
Correct. Yeah, they're homemade for a few years, and those homemade boards would look very different from each other because really no one is copying each other. I don't know. They're
Right.
reading about it, saying that the alphabet is on the board, and so they kind of play around with different designs. When Ouija comes out, it really becomes what most people want to use, what other manufacturers want to copy. It's the biggest one for a reason, and but Baltimore, they were from Baltimore, but its success, I think a lot of it has to do with obviously the railroad being there, and that is able to get their goods to all different parts of the country.
Mhm.
And, during World War II, later on, uh, when there's probably about 50 different manufacturers making copycat boards, Chicago becomes a big hub. Again, the Mississippi River or the Great Lakes. And so there, I think a lot of it has to do with where the train stations are and how they can get their goods to the rest of the country.
And that's actually why I like that part of dissecting something as a primary source, as far as the geography of it, is because it just demonstrates the transportation and the movement component of things that um, something like this, like a game or really anything, uh, if it's, it can remain regionally popular, it can be popular locally, but in order to get that widespread public and popularization, it really relies on the roads. It really relies on some kind of transport. And in this case, you're right, the B&O, Baltimore and Ohio, major railroad and other railroads, and the Chesapeake Bay itself. I mean, this is like the original foothold for the English in America was the Chesapeake, and having that, and not to mention, of course, the highways later on, the interstate highways especially, and it's just it proves, and something that we all kind of take for granted, at just how it still goes to this day in our e-commerce, click and expect something delivered the next day economy, where these roads and their upkeep and their ability to travel have kept culture moving around the country, nonstop for well over 100 years, and it's pretty incredible. And um, you know, I think about it sometimes because I don't know if you've ever been to Rochester, New York, where they have the Toy Hall of Fame, the Strong Museum, and I feel like they have at least a few boards there. But I asked one time on this podcast, why is Rochester, New York, the Toy Hall of Fame? And because unlike movies, where Hollywood is the hub, or music where you have a few different, again, Hollywood, New York, our Nashville, of course, our music centers, and other pop media comes out of certain specific places. Detroit, it's cars and music, Motown. Toys are kind of all over the place. Parker Brothers is from Salem. Um, right? Salem is Parker Brothers. And was it Hasbro's from Springfield, Massachusetts, or one of the other toy
They're
companies?
Pawtucket, Rhode Island, and Milton Bradley was Springfield, Mass.
That's right, Milton
The,
Bradley.
the
And
biggest ones for sure.
and Kenner is like Columbus, Ohio, and they're kind of scattered all over the place. There's really no home of toys. And so when it comes to these things, Baltimore, Chicago, it could be anywhere, but something about Baltimore seems to fit these particular, especially in the more macabre feeling of it. I mean, it's Edgar Allan Poe, stomping grounds. You have the vines on these old, washed out brick buildings. It kind of, the fog coming in every single day. It just kind of has, of course, Ouija's from here, you know?
Oh, I think it's when I meet people from Baltimore, and I let if they didn't know that history, I think they own it. They're very proud of it because Ouija can be creepy. It can be very spooky. It can also be campy. It can be goofy and fun, where people don't take it seriously. And I think Baltimore has a lot of those type of people there to embrace both all the different sides of the Ouija.
Was the people who made this, we have Bond and Kennard, were they successful in business prior to their adventures in Ouija, or is this what made them?
No, I mean Kennard did have I believe it was a manure uh factory, not factory. He was in manure business, and that's kind of where, when that did fail, he had the building, which is, I believe, how they Ouija kind of went to that first building they went to. Bond was a patent attorney, which is probably how he got brought in, was to kind of make sure that they could get the board patented. You know,
Hmm.
it's patented as a game, but it really shouldn't have been patented at all because it was homemade and kind of people were using them. It shouldn't have been. These guys, I'll call them spiritualists, but they're definitely uh, thinking more of along capitalist lines where they want to sell as many boards as possible. And they don't really tell you how it works. They just tell you that you put your hand on the planchette, you ask a question, and it moves. And you kind of decide for yourself, is that a spirit I'm speaking with? Is it my subconscious? Is it a mystery? And so by mail, it wouldn't get patented. They wouldn't sign off on it. And so Bond had to bring his sister-in-law Helen to the patent office with him to basically prove that it worked. Clerk after clerk, no one wanted to sign off on it. And finally, the chief patent clerk said, "I don't know you. You don't know me. If you can use the board and tell me my name, I'll give you the patent." Helen, being a strong medium, used it, told him his name, and that's how we got the patent. But I mean, she had to go there and prove it because they're leaving it very vague as to how it works.
I'm curious if that's another geographic component to it, because the patent office is right in Washington,
Yes,
and that's just a short ways away from Baltimore. So that kind of tenacity, that kind of persistence may have only have happened had they been because they were so close, and
sure.
kind of that business attitude. The country, and you mentioned this right from the start, that the country was reinventing itself with the major wars. Civil War was a renewal for the entire country, and I suppose this is just one of those other, kind of outputs of that. There's not only this particular new way of, this wave of spiritualism and trying to talk to the dead, but on top of that, you also have new business sense, that people are looking for ways to, and the same thing happens again after World War II, and I guess to a certain extent World War One, but World War II in particular, you have that reinvention of the country as well, and it seems that the board kind of finds itself by that point, and by the Second World War, the originators of it are no longer there, right? They're no longer with us.
Correct. I
They've
mean, it's still in the Fold family. William Fold had taken over, he'd been involved in the company by 1893, and he had taken it over by 1897. But so his family, he passes away, but his family still has it in Baltimore, the Ouija brand. They don't really sell that until 1966 when they sell it to Parker Brothers in Salem. So it does exist. It's in Baltimore at that time.
it's I think that Salem is a perfect place for your museum.
Definitely.
Yeah, because not only the Parker Brothers connection, but Salem has again reinvented itself as one of the spooky capitals of the country, the Halloween towns, if you will, along with places like Sleepy Hollow in New York, and I would even put Baltimore on there again, the Edgar Allan Poe connection.
Yep.
Um, there's a couple of these places throughout the country, but uh, it's, and I don't want to talk, we're not talking about Salem in particular here, but it's just one of those, and it's another place that kind of relies on the same kinds of changes that were happening, is reflective of the same changes happening in America. If you look at turn of the 20th century Salem, there really wasn't a whole lot of mention of the witch trials. It wasn't really a tourist attraction at all. And but as the 20th century progresses, and especially automobiles becoming more and more part of people's lives, and the concept of a day trip, leaving the cities or leaving your home and going down the road to visit something new. Suddenly it's being advertised as Witch Town. And, 1930s, they really are, bringing that up. And then eventually the police and the fire departments have a witch crossing the moon as their emblem on their badges and, patches and things. And it's, before you know it, it's, you know, it's Witch Central, right? Everybody's going there for some kind of spooky reason, and it becomes part of its appeal. Um, for a lot of the same reasons that we're talking about already, that this board kind of rides these different waves as well. That these, what the people are doing and how they're responding to modernity and industrialization and post-industrialization, um, riding the same kind of waves. So as time goes on, as we get to the mid 20th century, the audience has changed quite a bit, right? It's not what it once was. You don't really have as many seances going on. It's more kids goofing off. Would that be the main appeal?
I would think later on, but I think it's important to note that yes, seances and spiritualism when it starts, by the 1920s, like I mentioned, it's very romantic and it's a way to date and be unchaperoned. And even by the 30s, the Great Depression, where you think money would be tight, there were three factories in Baltimore producing the Ouija board. So
Hmm.
it's this time of uncertainty as well as spirit communication, as well as ulterior motives. And it kind of rides all these different things anytime. A time of war, of course, it's going to be very popular. But in the 20s, when there's no war, no, they use the Ouija board for dating. And so you can imagine it has different lives in that way. It's hitting all these different points, and the sleepover party game is definitely part of it. And today, we go into all sorts of pop culture. So I meet people who are buying the new Chucky board. They're buying the new Salem edition of the board, and Wednesday and the new Exorcist version. So it's in pop culture as well, and it stays that way. And the horror movies, 500 plus horror movies that put the Ouija board in it, kind of always help kind of keep it in people's back of their head in some way.
It's that popular culture component, the popularization, and not just pop culture as in media necessarily, but just our shared cultural values. And one of them, I think, that's very deeply rooted in Americans is this desire to like want information and not wanting to wait around for it. And I gotta know. And this for some people is just a fun game, but for other people, it's getting that information. It's learning something. I think about the way that there's a Ouija board of sorts in Stranger Things, and you have, an homage to that at the museum with the Christmas lights set up, and it's like the desperation of Winona Ryder's character, where she's like, I need to, what's happening to my son, and I'll do anything I can to, where somebody else would see the same thing and be like, that's goofy, that's fun, so it's like we have as a shared trait, I think, and it's going, across all of this time of like, I want information, even if it's just to tickle my funny bone, or it could be to talk to somebody that I thought I would never talk to again. Um, it kind of reminds me of the opening days of social media where people were like, wow, I remember that name from when I was a kid. I'm going to type
Sure.
it into see if they're still around and see if I can reconnect with them. So, Facebook might owe Ouija some money for that. It's an own version of it. Do you think there's anything to that way of thinking of like this just kind of represents the grand tradition of people seeking knowledge?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you have to think that to a lot of people, they look at it as it's my last chance or my one opportunity to be able to speak to someone, to tell them the last, something I didn't get a chance to tell them before they died, or find something out, ask a question or something. And so, yeah, I think that, the grieving part of it, especially wanted to connect with someone you lost, but also, we talk about Great Depression and job opportunities, financial questions, but also dating again, because asking who you're going to marry, when will I get married, what will my children's names be, or something even more like, when will I go on vacation or where will I go? Really any kind of thing like that that people want answers to, um, they want to talk. They want to be able to get that information from there.
I wonder if Magic 8 Ball has a similar following, or if it's not quite as much of an appeal because it's just the same one over and over again.
Sure.
Um,
I mean, it's in the same family as the Ouija
yeah.
board that way. Um, just like pendulum, just like tarot. Um, I think I've met people that like the Magic 8 Ball because they like that it's a very limited amount of options. The Ouija board, shoot, you could be, having conversations, having books dictated back to you. You could ask just about anything. And with the Magic 8 Ball, you got the same, whatever, six answers.
As we wrap things up, I have a question for you about your collection. I'm sure it has for each piece, there's a reason why it's among your favorite, and the reason's probably an interesting story. Do you have a top three of the pieces in your collection that you would like to share, and as to why you would say that your three favorite boards?
Yeah, I mean, the number one is my grandmother's board. That's the one that really sent me down the rabbit hole to want to learn as much as I could about them. And it's a very traditional looking Ouija that most people would probably think about when they imagined what a Ouija looks like. And she used it, like I said, she used it alone, and she flew on it, and she could yell out letters and numbers quicker than anyone could write down what she was saying. So it's pretty well worn. So not only is it hers, but first, and I like that you can see that it was used. Um, Probably one of the next items in the museum would be the pocket watch that William Fuld was wearing when he fell from the roof of the factory that the Ouija board actually told him to build.
Hmm.
He had used the Ouija board and it told him to prepare for big business. He interpreted that by building a second factory in Baltimore. Um, and we have the watch that he was wearing when he fell from the roof and died. That came from merch. He curated that for us. And then the third piece would be a teacup that was used by James Merrill. James Merrill was a writer and a poet who had writer's block, and he used a Ouija board to write a giant book of poetry that won a Pulitzer Prize. And the teacup is very special to me because Murch and I were together, and we met one of James' friends named Peter, who gifted it to us. And Murch and I had a great adventure doing that. And so the teacup is a reminder of my friendship with Murch and really a lot of the opportunities, conversations, people I get to meet, all because of the Ouija board. And Murch always makes a joke in his presentations that the Ouija is more about the living than the dead. The dead aren't buying Ouija boards, and clearly he's right. But for me, it is, all the different opportunities and people I get to meet because of the Ouija board. Being at the museum, it's my favorite way to spend time, going there and meeting people. I'm very enthusiastic to want to talk about the Ouija board to anyone who's willing to listen. So I get excited being there, and then the teacup is a nice reminder of my friendship with Merch.
Those are incredible stories, and I'm sure that that's what drives you to keep doing this because, like you just said, just three items have incredible stories, and all the boards that you have on the wall have a story or another, and they inspire people to tell stories, their own connections to boards or experiences that they had. And so I think you and I have a shared interest in learning about other people through these things that connect us, in this case, a Ouija board. So I want to thank you so much for joining me on this podcast. Before we go, what's the best way that people can, find you? Obviously, if they're in Salem, it's not a very far walk down from the visitor center in downtown. Is right across the street from there, basically. But where can people find you to plan a trip?
If you're in Salem, then yeah, Salem Witchmore Museum, which is on Essex Street, the busy street that most people go to in Salem. A couple months ago, I actually opened a second location in Baltimore. So I'm in Hamden, right above a store called Bazaar, which is an oddity shop. And Greg and Brian are great people, and I have a museum above their store. If you can't make it to either location, you can of course look up SalemWitchboardMuseum.com, or find either museum on Instagram. That's usually where I'm the most active, posting and keeping people up to date.
And Instagram is one of my favorite places to be too. And I think it's just for these kinds of cultural pieces, just perfect setup for that. We take nice pictures, and I'm sure in this month of October, you're probably very busy with lots of those things, both in the museums and online. And so I want to thank you again for taking the time for the Everything is a Primary Source podcast.
Thank you for having me. It was great talking with you.
Take care. Popular culture, by definition, connects and unites us and proves that people of different backgrounds, in fact, have a lot in common with one another. I hope you enjoyed this conversation, at least in part, for that reason. If it connects with you and you'd like to add to it, or any of the podcast episodes, just visit everything-history.com and search for the Everything is a Primary Source project, which can be found in the classroom section of the website. We'd love to hear what you have to say. Be sure to rate and share this podcast wherever you are listening to it now, and follow Everything as a Primary Source on social media, including YouTube and especially Instagram. Thank you for listening to the EPS podcast, where everything is a primary source.